We have been, especially those of us who left, we were trying to establish our lives in our refugee countries. Many of us disconnected with their past to be able to continue. And then literally on the 8th of December, we were completely dragged back to the daily issues, conversations, planning. It's a very surprising miracle.
Welcome to Making Peace Visible, the podcast about peace, conflict, and the media. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. This is a pivotal moment in Syria, the abrupt end of a brutal dictatorship that killed and tortured thousands and terrorized Syrian society. It's also a fragile moment. The big question is, what happens next? And what does this change mean to the region? In this episode, we welcome back Zaina Erhaim to share her perspective on the sudden fall of the Assad regime and what's ahead for Syria. Zaina is an award-winning Syrian journalist who's widely recognized for her commitment to ethical reporting and amplifying marginalized voices. She began her career reporting on the civil war in Syria, but fled to the UK after both the regime and the opposition threatened her life. She's now managing editor of Jim, a feminist Arabic website, and a communications consultant. Zaina, thank you very much for returning to our podcast to share your thoughts on the epic changes taking place in your home country.
Sure. Thank you for hosting me.
The op-ed that you wrote in the New York Times just a few days after the fall of the Assad regime was poignant. You gave us a vivid picture of what you and your family went through under Assad. Please tell us what you're hearing, seeing, feeling now.
It's difficult to literally grasp what is happening or how. I think there is a general feeling of unbelief. There is something that has been literally on our chests, on our lives, forced us to completely change who we are, what we want to be, where we're going to be, and then suddenly disappeared. I think all of those whom I'm speaking with are pretty much confused. No one can identify one or two or even 10 different emotions that they're having. Crying of joy, confusion, missing, anger, also sadness, because I think we already started to see the scale of crimes committed. But the general theme is that we're back. We have been, especially those of us who left, we were trying to establish our lives in our refugee countries. Many of us disconnected with their past to be able to continue. And then literally on the 8th of December, we were completely dragged back to the daily issues, conversations, planning. It's a very surprising miracle.
The way this story of regime change in Syria has been told in the Western media, it's almost like it came out of nowhere. This was considered a frozen conflict for many years, and even though the rebel groups controlled part of Syria, no one expected them to topple Assad, and so easily. Is that how it felt to you?
I wasn't expecting Assad to leave or to be toppled, and I think it's a combination of lots of issues. It is the uprising that started in 2011. It is the general political situation. It is the interference of Iran. It's the fall of Hezbollah. It's a lot of things that I believe politically shaped the right moment for the rebels to advance, for him to leave. But speaking about Western media, I have lots of things to say about Western media, but I believe the point that is missing is that there is no conflict that is frozen conflict. The conflict is a conflict. We've seen that in Gaza. We've seen that in Syria, and it will happen everywhere until there is a meaningful peace that is built on justice. Things are going to be escalating on all levels always. And lots of us have been telling everyone who is working on Syria that although it's stable now, it will explode at some point. When luckily so far, there is no kind of bloodshed or like a huge scale of violations. But it couldn't have happened because literally there is no authority controlling whatever. And we were left alone being told, no, you're stable now, it's going to be all right. And I think international media played a huge role into this. And Syria dropped from the headlines and it was considered stable. Many were advocating for reestablishing Assad, inviting him to go back to the Western world. And here we are.
Yeah, it's amazing how fragile it was and how fast it all ended. I mean, it was extremely difficult to be a journalist in Assad's Syria. That's why you left the country in 2017. You weren't safe. You personally faced threats not only from the regime, but from Islamist rebel groups too. How has the news environment changed in the past few weeks?
Well, I think that the first fascinating thing that we kind of forget about is that we are living in the same country. The disconnections between those who are living in regime held areas and those who were living in rebel or Kurdish areas was so severe that we forgot that we're in one country. So suddenly, when the rebel were in Damascus, we've seen lots of journalists, many of them our colleagues. We know that they were independent, but they wouldn't dare to report. Many started revealing their names. We were working with them with pseudonyms for like a decade or more. And they finally started to show up and show themselves. I think one of the main elements is that also in Damascus and in the other areas, the number of women journalists is much more than in the north, because those areas are more like city-oriented, open-minded communities. And actually, most of the journalists that I know in the capital are actually women, those who I trust and I usually recommend. This, and then seeing how many we have and seeing how diverse we have and being able to actually communicate directly without them being scared. If I contacted them, they might be interrogated by the security forces because I'm wanted for the regime and they don't want to be associated with me. I mean, that state of fear to be lifted.
I know. I mean, Syria's people have been living in a state of fear for decades under the Assad regime, and that fear probably won't evaporate overnight. And yet it appears to be lifting significantly for the first time. That's a big, big change.
It's a half a century. It's half a century of state of fear.
Wow.
And the one from the regime is kind of over, but I think that there is still a state of fear from the chaos, from the unknown, from the lack of authorities, or even from criticizing anyone with a weapon now. Some people are daring to do so, others are skeptical, because as you said, like half a century of fear can't really be lifted within a couple of days.
What can reporters and editors do to shine a light on progressive change and grassroots peace-building movements in Syria?
Well, I think now it's easier because the road is open. They could go there, they have access, and there are plenty of journalists on the ground that they can count on. It's more essential than ever to really count on locals and treat them as proper journalists, not as fixers, to give them the platform to have their bylines written. I mean, especially those who were outside the regime-held areas, they were literally working as professional journalists for at least 10 years now, and they are writing in many different international media. But unless it's the international journalists coming in by themselves, the story is not there, because the Syrian sources are still, after all what happened, are not considered a professional enough journalist to be writing their own stories.
For those listening, that subject was the main focus of our previous interview with Zaina. And if you're interested in learning more about that aspect of covering civil wars like that, it's a great interview. What can the international donor community do to support independent journalists and journalism in Syria?
Now, lots of initiatives are being formed. I am personally working on one of them to support specifically women journalists, because I've seen during the last years how much they were taken advantage of and used by different institutions and media. And then they were eventually left alone when they needed. So trying to do this kind of peer support, solidarity, not just with international media, with regional, even with the suppression of their patriarchal communities or whatever authorities that are trying to silence them. So supporting such initiatives, really listening to the needs. Before that, they were saying, we cannot access Syria. We wouldn't be able to know what people need. Well, now you can. And there is no censorship on the internet. So even if you can't be there on foot, you can actually speak with people. You just need to speak the language.
Well, that really sounds like the right thing to do. Because we really need grassroots reporting, and that's the only people who can do that are Syrian journalists. Are there stories that Syrian journalists are reporting that we're not seeing in the international or English language press?
There is the fear, there is the happiness. There are families who are literally printing out their missing loved ones' pictures and pasting it all over Syria, trying to find a trace. There are mass graves being discovered. Lots of my friends who went back to Syria for the first time are going back to the cells where they were imprisoned. I hope we will be seeing more. I hope we will be hearing, especially about the struggle of the missing people, because international community organizations need to do more on helping people finding their loved ones, organizing and figuring out bodies in the mass graves, documenting crimes, and starting all this legal procedure for justice. I think it's all needed, and we cannot do it on our own.
When you were reporting from Syria during the civil war, your journalism focused not on the fighting, but on the lives of civilians, particularly women. What stories about women are you seeing coming out of Syria now? And what kinds of stories do you expect to see in the coming months?
I'm following women journalists who are writing or doing blogs for international media. They are trying to document daily lives. For example, like a main square in Marj in Damascus, which is called the Martyrs Square, because the Ottoman Empire hanged anti-Ottoman rebels in it. But then suddenly all the families start pasting the pictures of their missing members in it. So it actually became our new Martyrs Square. Women are not only reporting on the gender issues, but really on daily living issues. Specific women's stories, I haven't seen like a special one, but there is plenty of writings about the transitional government that had no women in it, and about the roles of women or press releases and issues that the women organization are issuing. There is lots of events, civil movements and engagements that we haven't seen in 13 years.
The rebel group that toppled the regime is called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, also known as HTS. They began to form in 2012 in your hometown, Idlib. Now that they're in power, HTS and their leader, Mohammed al-Jalani, have been going through a kind of rebrand, so to speak. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, according to the rebrand, his name is Ahmed al-Shara, and that was the previous name, al-Jalani. I think as a communication person, it was an impressive and very well-studied marketing campaign, from the change of the style to the language to the press release to even the military outfit that he'd adapted, which is pretty much the Zelensky style,
Right.
the Western darling fighter figure. Everything was really studied, and it seemed like lots of Syrians really forgot how it was, because the change is huge. I think if Assad did a couple of the things that Ahmed al-Shara is doing now, maybe he would have still been in power, but he was so stubborn and not flexible at all to respond to any demand from the people. And for example, when the new government was formed, someone used the white flag with La ilaha illallah. It's like an Islamic flag. And lots of people, Syrians, were like objecting this, and why you're using this, and it's not our flag. And then the next meeting, it was removed.
Right. So they're listening.
Exactly, which is something that we're completely not used to it.
That's interesting.
Syrians want this government, I think, to succeed in transitioning it into a democracy. They are speaking about elections. They're speaking about like a national dialogue. But I mean, there are plenty of stories, like today, a story about women who went to an official office to get papers and she collapsed crying in front of it. So a journalist came to her filming, "What's wrong? Did anyone bother you?" And she said, "I'm crying because I can't believe it. I just got in. I was welcomed. And then within 10 minutes, I was able to get the signature and stamp I needed." And for her, it was so kind of unbelievable that made her emotional because, I mean, in Syria, if you want to do any official paper, they will literally humiliate you, make you pay lots of bribes. And so in her testimony, she said they were smiling. They asked me, "How am I doing?" And then they actually gave me the things that I needed.
Wow, that's quite unusual. Yeah, because one of the questions I was going to ask you is, do you think it's an authentic shift?
There are plenty of things that people are reporting which are making us so emotional. And it's also so sad that it's strange. Like I sent an email to the embassy and they actually responded.
Amazing.
And that's an astonishing fact. So for the first time, we start hearing things like, "This belongs to us." There are plenty of flyers around Syria now about asking people not to throw like rubbish on the floor and to take care of their public institutions, because I think many feel for the first time that this is ours, or it could be.
In a recent article that you wrote, you pointed out that there have been no women in leadership roles in the new regime. Does that concern you?
Well, this is supposed to be a transitional body. It is concerning that there are no women whatsoever in it. But also, as the interviewees, the women influential politicians and activists that I interviewed, they said, well, this transitional government is formed by a military group. And generally, where is the military group? We don't see women, whether it's liberal, radical, or Islamist, it's the same. Women don't have a space on a military transitional government. Recently, a woman was hired for a women unit, something within the government. So now there is one, but she's not a minister or like a higher official. But since the formation of the governments, women have been protesting almost daily in different towns of Syria, saying we exist and we have a place and we're here. So it's not only online campaigns, but in person as well. We're seeing press releases, we're seeing different kind of pressure applied, all from inside. I think after 14 years, we now believe that we can't count on international communities. We don't need a German or UK delegation telling the new authorities that you need to include women. Most of the local initiatives, the humanitarian initiatives, are actually led by women. So I was a bit scared at the beginning, but as I'm seeing the women's movement now, I think they should be scared. I mean, those who are excluding the women are the ones who are supposed to be scared.
Right. I mean, because the women played a very, very strong role during the Assad regime in the many women's groups that were formed. So they really have some experience, in a sense, speaking out and being active to assert their rights and their roles.
And it's not just about their rights and roles. They were literally holding their communities together. They were the main tool to help them survive, whether through humanitarian aid, whether through the different initiatives that they created. They created these spaces for women to find jobs where men were imprisoned. I wouldn't say it's like after the World War II, but in general, their role was literally the main survival tool that the communities, especially in rebel-held areas, were able to hold on. And even if they didn't do any of this, they exist. They are over half of the population. And we know, and it's proven, that without their fully and active participation in any transitional government, we wouldn't have a sustainable peace.
Well, that's been proven many times that the peace agreements that have active participation of women are much more durable. After decades of dictatorial rule in Syria, how strong is civil society, broadly speaking?
It's been 14 years where civil society organizations were trying to adapt to the different situations, different authorities navigating, even when having to immigrate or to be refugees abroad or working from remotely. Lots of expertise. A friend joked yesterday saying, well, unlike Iraq, in Syria, we wouldn't need foreign experts. We are all foreigners now.
Right.
And we are all experts because all of us worked in kind of international developments. And now lots of us have international passports. So we are experts as the Western white definition, but we're not white yet. So the expertise built up, different contexts, even the political conversation that is happening now, sharing the different experiences. Lots of initiatives had experience working on other conflicts. Like for me, for example, I've been focusing on Iraq for a lot of time. Others were working in Burma, Sudan. Lots of Syrians were in Ukraine. So this diversity of experiences in other conflicts and other contexts, I think that all is going to be a great added value to understanding what's happening and to be able to drive it into hopefully a more peaceful and sustainable place.
Yes, let's hope that the civil society has the capacity to do what's needed to rebuild the country.
Capacity and support. Yes, let's hope.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, let's hope the international community is going to do something right this time.
Right.
Inshallah.
Well, organizing to fight and defeat an entrenched dictator requires one set of skills. Governing requires another. It sounds like you have a momentarily positive impression of HTS's ability to govern. Can you say more about it?
Well, I think we haven't seen anything yet, but one of the really sarcastic things is that most of the international media and even international people are asking Syrians, so what's going to be happening now with the government? Or that we are worried about Syria now. Not actually knowing that we did not have a government before. We had a criminal drug dealer who was literally taking advantage of everything within the government for their own benefits. It wasn't a government that is working for public service. So being worried now that this might bring more trouble, I mean, lots of Syrians have this joke also spreading around saying, well, we already hit the base, what they call it.
We already hit bottom, you mean?
Yes. So there is this joke now among Syrians for those people who are asking us, aren't you afraid that your situation is going to be worse? We were the worst of the worst. And anything that's happening now, it's going to be a bit better than the worst that we've been at before. And I think just being able to speak and disagree now is astonishing, and it's a great step forward. Yeah.
Astonishing. There's been a massive diaspora. What will it take for Syrian refugees to come home? I mean, I know a lot of them have already come home.
For those who are living in neighboring countries, I think most probably they will go home because they don't even have the right documents, papers, and they are being discriminated against or even forced to live in camps. Many would love to go back to their homes, but their homes are destroyed. So unless there are initiatives to rebuild or to create spaces for them, they wouldn't be able to come back from Turkey or from the borders. For general Syrians, I'm hearing a lot of people speaking about going back, but it's not completely stable now. Maybe after the elections or when this national dialogue is happening, lots of people are thinking about this as a kind of confirming point or a milestone, because they would believe that, okay, this is only transitional, it's going to be stable, and then we're moving on. But also the economical situation, lots of refugees cannot really go back. They don't have jobs, they lost their homes, they're starting from below zero. So there are lots of things to be taken into consideration, not to mention the lack of authority, which is also scary now.
Countries face a big decision at the end of a civil war. I mean, actually, many decisions, but a major one is about seeking justice for victims. Recently, you published a list of names of 14 of your relatives who were killed in prison. First, can you talk about what crimes or transgressions landed people in Assad's prisons?
Well, the funny element is that no one knows. They could say whatever, and they don't even tell you what you're accused of. They would just be kidnapped either from their homes or from the street, from a demonstration, and they would disappear. And those 14 are only the ones who were killed under torture in Assad prison because my hometown has been out of the regime control for so long. So my family has the least amount of people, victims who were killed under torture. Other families in the areas like Damascus or Homs who were under the regime control for longer, they are publishing a list of 40, 45, each family. In Rukn al-Din in Damascus, there was a general funeral for 50 persons who were lost from that one neighborhood. In Jaramana as well, the women did their own ceremony, and they had a huge hall full of women wearing black and white headscarf and singing while holding their sons' pictures or loved ones' pictures. We're speaking about like 5% of the population were imprisoned.
Yeah.
So the amount of grief, knowing the connections between the family. So even if it's like the wife of the cousin, it's like a sister for the British people. We are close. So the amount of grief is major. We are starting to deal with it now, especially that people haven't yet got a conclusion. Those 14 are the ones confirmed. So they were able to find a certificate saying they are killed, but there are plenty others that are still missing.
Do you think that there's a drive to seek justice for your relatives or for other people's relatives?
In general, I mean, we have been speaking, all Syrians have been speaking about justice literally since the first day in 2011. And we were speaking about justice for those who were already imprisoned or already killed for opposing the regime. And it went on and on. Lots of victims associations were formed with one main target, that is justice. We've seen lots of courts following international laws because that was the only way for Syrians to get justice, whether in Germany, whether in France, Switzerland. I mean, this is something that Syrians are literally dedicating their lives for. And seeing what we're seeing now, after everyone were able to see where their loved ones were imprisoned and the kind of tools used to torture them and the detailed, horrific reports about what they went through. If we didn't get justice, I think things are going to be aggressive, certainly, again. So justice is not just something that we should demand. It's essential for stability. It's the core of any kind of peace that we hope we will get soon.
Bashar al-Assad and his family have fled to Russia. They're being given asylum there by Vladimir Putin. How do you think the Syrian people might get justice?
Assad is not the only criminal, but he is the main criminal in the Syrian context. But there are lots of other figures, like his brother, there are reports that he is also in Russia today. Ali Mamlouk and other officials who are already on the wanted list for the crimes that they committed. We don't trust Russia with justice, but I think there is always hope that some kind of pressure could be applied. There are plenty of money that Assad belongs, or his wife, British wife, belongs, that should be, or at least some of it is in international banks that could be frozen, that could be sent back. We've seen how long the fight to actually put his uncle, Rafat al-Assad, into accountable, despite having his French nationality and like his crime committed in Hama in the 1980s is proven. But it took more than 20 years to actually put him on the wanted list for his crimes. So we know it's a long process, but I think there are lots of things that could happen. Some things could happen quicker, like seizing their funding, returning the money to Syrians, and things that would take longer, like trials and putting them into justice. But I think for lots of families, just knowing that they are scared, that they might be persecuted, is such a relief. For the first time, it's not us who are scared, it's the criminals.
You said in the New York Times op-ed piece that you can now go back. Will you go back?
I will, but also we need to to take into our consideration the paperwork status. Lots of Syrians, even those who have the right documents to go to Syria, they cannot get visas to go to Lebanon, Jordan, or Turkey, or Iraq. So until there are direct flights to Syria, many Syrians, we wouldn't be able to go back to it. So lots of Syrians, even those who want to go, they either have a refugee travel document, which doesn't allow them to go because you will lose your refugee status, or even if they have like a Syrian passport with a residency, unless they have visas to neighboring countries, they cannot cross. So there are lots of obstacles still.
Zaina, I'm very grateful for your sharing your perspective and your knowledge about the country with us. We're nearing the end of the interview. Is there anything I didn't ask that you think is important to talk about?
Well, something for my international colleagues, going back to Syria or speaking about Syria again, I think it's really essential to study your internal biases. It's really essential to open your mind about your prejudices. Ask yourself whether the kind of questions that you ask to the Syrian are affected by a colonial mentality. Would you ask this question to another fellow white person? Would you report a story about another fellow white person? It's really essential to ask these questions to be able to reach the core of the story and to report a genuine and really a human story.
Well, that's so important. And you've been writing about that. As a matter of fact, I think we first met after you posted 10 rules for international journalists in LinkedIn. And that's when I thought it would be interesting to talk.
And that was about Ukraine, but now it could apply here as well.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Zaina. We really appreciate your participating with our podcast.
Thank you, Jamil.
We have links in the show notes to some of Zaina's recent writing and reporting on Syria. Also, check out our first episode with Zaina if you haven't heard it already. The episode is called Decolonizing International Journalism. You can find a link in the show notes. The Making Peace Visible podcast is produced and edited by Andrew Maraskin. Faith McClure is the creative director of Making Peace Visible, and she also edits the podcast. I'm Jamil Simon. 2024 has been an exciting year for Making Peace Visible. We talked to journalists covering peace initiatives, nonviolent protests, and reconciliation in Tibet, Lebanon, Uganda, and the United States. We spoke with some incredible peace builders, including Ali Abu Awad, the leader of the Palestinian movement Tagir, and David Lehrer, who's pioneering cross-border collaboration on the environment in the Middle East. I also got to interview William Ury, a legend in the peace-building field and one of my personal heroes. We'd love to know what you want to hear on this show in 2025. You can write us a review on Apple Podcasts or send an email to info@makingpeacevisible.org. Or fill out a brief survey in our show notes. If you've enjoyed the podcast so far, please don't keep it to yourself. Send your friends and colleagues a link to makingpeacevisible.org/podcast, where you can browse our archive of over 50 original episodes. Thanks so much for listening, and talk soon.